Common Core standards.
I'll talk to you soon. Bye.
Before the fall of 2012, very little was known about the Common Core. The media wasn't covering it. It wasn't a part of the national discourse. It wasn't even on parents' radars. But by January 2013, questions started rolling in.
For the Common Core standards has been a very long time in the making. The need has become increasingly clear. As the United States becomes increasingly mobile, it no longer made sense to have 50 sets of standards. It has become increasingly important for American students to be prepared to compete with students around the globe.
And we worked to create a program initiative called Achieve. It set national standards in a couple of subjects, grammar and math. Now, the program eventually evolved into what is known as Common Core, adopted in 2010.
It is a shift about standards, it's a shift about assessment, because it means they will be equally measured, and it's finally a shift about curriculum.
It sounds good. So why is there growing opposition in Ohio and around the country to Common Core?
Sadly, the very label Common Core has come to be associated with things that I detest.
From Common Core,
as parents, we want high standards. We want accountable schools. But the problem is, this goes well beyond that.
These standards aren't rigorous, just different, designed for an industrial model of school.
And a guy by the name of Robert Small, he was arrested last week at a school board meeting.
Don't stand for this. You're sitting here like cattle.
Questioning the school's hotly debated Common Core curriculum.
Here's the history of the Common Core. In 2009, the National Governors Association and the Council of Chief State School Officers partnered with Achieve, Inc., a nonprofit that received millions of funding from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Thus, the initiative seemed to spring from states when in reality it was contrived by an insular group of educational testing executives with only 2 academic content specialists. Neither specialist approved the final standards, and the English consultant Dr. Sandra Stotsky publicly stated she felt the standards left students with an empty skill set lacking literary knowledge. While educators and administrators were later included in the validation committee and feedback groups, they did not play a role in the actual drafting of the standards. The product is a, quote, rigorous preparation for career and college, yet many educators agree that rigorous is a buzzword. These standards aren't rigorous, just different, designed for an industrial model of school. Nevertheless, Common Core emerged. Keep in mind the specific standards were never voted upon by Congress, the Department of Education, state or local governments, yet their implementation was approved by 49 states and territories. The president essentially bribed states into implementation via Race to the Top, offering $4.35 billion taxpayer dollars to participating states, $500 million of which...
You know, what's really interesting about the Common Core in terms of its genesis is we see the same players who were working on this in the 1990s working on it again. You have some of the bit players like Checker Finn from Fordham has been around it, pushing for this stuff, but the people who've really played a larger role are people like Mark Tucker, who became famous with his Dear Hillary letter, a 17-page letter that described to Hillary how we could transform American education to something that more approximated the German system, which focused on workforce development with great databases that will allow us to pinpoint where we should push kids. Achieve Incorporated. Achieve Incorporated has worked with states for a long time in trying to develop cross-state collaborations, which is a good thing, right? If Massachusetts wants to collaborate with Connecticut, absolutely for it. But they took a larger role here trying to push the idea of creating a Common Core set of standards. And they were funded by the Gates Foundation at a very high clip, as was Fordham.
People who worked on these initiatives in the past, in the George H.W. Bush administration and the Bill Clinton administration, discovered that it was unpopular to have the federal government do this. So Governor Romer of Colorado and former Governor Hunt both came to the conclusion that in order to do this, they had to get the origin. They needed a kind of an immaculate conception of these standards.
And what was the Race to the Top program?
Oh, so the Race to the Top program was a competitive grant program that was part of President Obama's stimulus package. So it was $4.35 billion, and it was a portion of states could apply, and they had to prove that they were sort of doing a lot of the reforms that the Obama administration supported. So things like revamping teacher evaluation, increasing the number of charter schools, and changing their standards. So adopting Common Core or Common Core-like standards played a very large role in that. Yeah, so the federal government played a very powerful role in incentivizing states to adopt the Common Core standards.
Today we crossed an important threshold in education reform. Today we're announcing the draft guidelines for states to apply for the $4.35 billion Race to the Top fund.
Arne Duncan basically, as the Secretary of Education, went to each state and said that each state has a couple of months basically to write a grant to become eligible for federal funding under the stimulus package, federal grant funding. And this was a time when austerity had hit hard in the wake of the Great Recession of 2008/2009. So a lot of states were desperate for funding. So without any real deliberate process, these states wrote the grants, got the really influential signatures on the grants. Now, when they signed off on the grants, they signed off on the Race to the Top mandates.
Sandra Stotsky, and I was the Senior Associate Commissioner in the Massachusetts Department of Education, the 1999 to 2003, where I was in charge of the development or revision of all of our K-12 standards in all major subjects.
I've been a full professor at Stanford for almost 45 years.
And of relevance to a discussion of Common Core, let me add that I was on the Common Core Validation Committee.
I was the person on validation who was directly responsible for overseeing the mathematical core standards were proceeding and their writing and the quality of them.
We had to sign a confidentiality agreement that we would not ever discuss what took place in the meeting itself. This, of course, is very different from all the other civic committees I've ever been in, which were subjected to sunshine laws.
A number of the people that led the writing projects for both of these are now in very high positions. For example, one of them is the head of the College Board, which controls a whole group of exams. These people have not been very forthcoming. They've been very careful in what they say, and I don't think they've given the public any real idea of what's actually going on.
We were expected to say, apparently, that these standards were internationally benchmarked, they followed procedures that were appropriate, a few other things, and I couldn't do that. Then, about 2 weeks later, I discovered there was a report on the validation committee on the website for Common Core. It simply listed the members who were on the committee, and then it listed the names of people who signed on. But when I counted up the number of names, we were missing 5, so that's when I figured out that there were 5 people who had not signed on.
5 out of 30 is a very large number, considering the fact that we were under enormous political pressure to actually sign on. And we kind of expected that there would be something like a minority report, or there would be some acknowledgement of the existence of this dissent. And no, there was none. The 5 people who didn't agree to sign the letter simply were expunged from the record. And so it was possible for people in the education world to say that everybody approved of core standards, and indeed they are benchmarked at international standards and so on.
The biggest misconception that Common Core proponents push on people is that there is any evidence that a system like Common Core will benefit children. We have no track record. And the track record we have is points against Common Core. And then people who know about academic content, academic quality, are telling us that Common Core is of poor quality.
In the request for proposals for the Race to the Top money, that $4.5 billion the government is using as seed money to encourage the adoption of Common Core, is a series of requirements that in order to apply for this money, the presidents of the public universities in each state that applies have to sign a letter agreeing that if a student comes to the university or college, as the case may be, from high school, having passed a standardized exam in the content of the basic course Algebra 2, it is not permitted in this, specifically not permitted, to put them in remedial courses. Currently today, over 40% of the students in this country have to take remedial courses in mathematics. And what they're saying in effect is that we can't remediate, we have to give them credit-bearing courses. The long-term effect of that is simply that the credit-bearing courses will drop in content to the point where they fit to what we're getting out of K-12. And that's a severe, what the educators call dumbing down of a system that is the only system that is giving us the long-term economic support that we require.
I believe we have on this. Thank you. Thank you. The definition of college readiness, I think it's a fair critique that it's a minimal definition of college readiness.
For some colleges.
Well, for the colleges most kids go to, but not that most parents probably aspire, right?
It's not for STEM. It's not for international
That's true. It's not only not for STEM. It's also not for selective colleges that, for example, UC Berkeley, even whether you're going to be an engineer or not, you'd better have pre-calculus to get into UC Berkeley, right? But we have to think of our engineering colleges. And that's true. I think
the Jason Zimba's verbatim testimony to the March meeting of the Massachusetts Board of Education is as smoking a gun as you're going to get. What Zimba is saying, finally and clearly, is this background is barely enough to get a student into a non-selective college or a community college, but everybody gets into a community college. And it is not enough to get into STEM, but more than STEM, it's not even enough to get into a selective university.
Let's begin by considering the word rigorous. That you hear every proponent of Common Core use to describe these standards, and says constantly, we want rigorous standards for our state. Our previous standards weren't rigorous, and so on. Every state uses this kind of verbiage. For me, and as a mathematician, and probably for most of you, when we hear the word rigorous, we think careful, precise, and above all correct. Now, it may have a connotation of boring, frustrating, but what we think specifically is above all correct. But for educators, this is too boring. So for people who speak educationese, then it has a different meaning. And I think it's very important that we understand this different meaning. Now, I put the whole definition into these notes that were being sent out, the incomprehensible Common Core math standards. But let me read one sentence. They may use the term rigorous to describe learning environments that are not intended to be harsh, rigid, or overly prescriptive, but that are stimulating, engaging, and supportive. Now, if you think about that for a minute, you will realize that this is the dead opposite of what we in the real English-speaking world think of as rigorous. So what you've got is you've got this professional educator, if you want, typically a distinguished faculty member within the schools of education, standing up in front of people and saying, we have created rigorous standards. Well, you're thinking one thing, but what are they thinking? They're thinking creative, flexible, fun. In mathematics, and now I'll talk about mathematics, the standards themselves are very low level. They're said to be internationally benchmarked. Well, they gave up on that after a while, and now if you read the website, they say they were compared to the international standards of the high-achieving countries. Compared. No implication whatsoever that they were comparable, just compared. And in fact, overall, in the Common Core standards, if you compare them against the standards of the high-achieving countries internationally, then by 8th grade, they're 2 to 3 years behind. But as bad as that sounds, something that I haven't told people about, a lot of people have heard that, what I haven't told people about is that it's far worse for the high school graduates. The high school math curriculum stops with Algebra 2. And Algebra 2 is barely the beginning of the real subject. Moreover, sitting in the middle of that is the standards for geometry. And those are interesting. It is the approach there, and I don't know that Professor Stotsky emphasized enough the degree to which the Common Core standards prescribe pedagogy. They tell the teachers how to teach and what to teach. Standards, it's not unreasonable that standards tell them what to teach, but it's a new phenomenon. The standards tell them how to teach it. In particular, the prescriptive description of the geometry that occurs in the Common Core standards, I guess I would describe it as describing one of the strangest approaches to geometry in the world. And moreover, it's one that we know has not worked the few times it has been tried in the past, except, to be honest, to be fair, for one really tiny little area in Flemish-speaking Belgium. That's it. There is no research basis in the literature or in experience, in the experiences internationally, for this particular form of geometry course. And that is typical of the kind of research that is actually in the Common Core standards. Thank you.
Precisely on the weak spot of the Common Core. Nobody knows if there is such a thing as being at the same time college and career ready. Maybe there are two separate goals. Nobody knows. In fact, the National Assessment Governing Board tried to answer this question around 2008, and there was a big technical panel studying this exact question, whether there is a possibility of having a single test showing whether a student is both prepared for career and for college. They came back and they said, there is no research about it, we are not sure, we need to study it. Half a year later, the Common Core came along and declared by fiat, without any substantiation, oh, yes, we can do it, and here they are. So they put a stake in the ground, supposedly the goalpost for all high school students in America. And they call this goalpost both career and college ready. Now let's be serious. If 100% of students can be college ready, and we obviously politically cannot fail half of them or a quarter of them or 2/3 of them, whatever it will happen, it cannot be real college readiness. It has to be a low-level college readiness. On the other hand, if it will be too low level, people will complain. It will be too obvious, so they have to put it high. Suddenly the career readiness becomes too demanding.
So some people will complain it's too low for college readiness, and they're right. It is too low because otherwise half of the cohort will fail. Other people will complain it's too high for the career readiness, and they're right. It is too high for career readiness because otherwise the college readiness will look ridiculous on its face. It's an untenable position. It's a change of the way we used to run our lives in our society. Some kids wanted to go to college, and they took the college prep classes in high school, and they would go to SAT or ACT or whatever other tests they did, IB, AP, and they will be college ready. They will prepare for college. Other children did not, and they would fill up later if they're late bloomer, that's fine. But declaring by fear that everybody will be career and college ready looks like an untenable goal, and that's exactly what you see, this schism. Well, is it too high? Is it too low? Does it make sense? The truth is it makes no sense. But that's it.